Ja hyvää iltaa. Enhän ole millään viekkaudella enkä vääryydellä tunkeutunut tietokoneeseesi, vaan olet sen itse avannut ja siksi pyydän sinulta nöyrimmästi huomiota. Tämä on mielenkiintoinen ilta omasta mielestäni. Hetken kuluttua kerron, mitä on tulossa. Mutta sitä ennen ihan lyhyesti haluan mainita, että jos sinulle ei tule vielä Patmos-lähetyssäätiön ystäväpostia, eli tätä Patmos-viestiä, joka on meidän ihan uusi julkaisumme, tabloid-lehtemme, niin käy liittymässä Patmoksen postuslistalle. Tilaaminen on ilmaista, se käy vaivattomasti ja saat säännöllisesti kotiisi näitä meidän lehtiä. Tämä on itse asiassa menneen pääsiäisen numero, joka on täysin hengellinen lehti, aihetta Jeesuksen rististä, ristin kuolemasta, ylösnousemuksesta. Ja sitten tämä tuorein lehtemme, joka käsittelee radiotyötä Jeesus kuuluu kaikille. Piispojen avioliittoesitys on variksen vala, kirjoitetaan sivulla 2. Sivulla 5 kerrotaan, kuinka satanistit valittivat Radio Patmoksesta ja hävisivät. Ja sivulla 6 kysytään, rakastatko Jeesusta? Ja kerrotaan muutakin ajankohtaista. Eli jos sulle ei tule vielä Patmos-lähetyssäätiön postia, niin käy tilaamassa ja saat sitä aivan ilmaiseksi. Ja tämän radiopostimme mukana tulee myöskin tämä kirjeeni, jossa kerron tästä Yleisradion uutiskukkasesta, jonka he sitten tosin korjasivat siitä, että Israel ei olisi sallinut avustusten menemistä Gazaan, ja täällä on jopa tilasto mukana tästä UNRWAn omista tilastoista, joka osoittaa pelkästään maaliskuun ajalta, että sinne on mennyt satoja rekkalastillisia. Itse asiassa on mennyt monta tuhatta, kun lasketaan nämä päivittäiset määrät kaikki yhteen, mutta siis päivittäin keskimäärin niin kuin pitkälti toista sataa, yli parisataa rekkaa tuohon aikaan maaliskuussa. Nythän ne lukumäärät ovat sitten huomattavasti kasvaneet, ja kerron tässä myöskin siitä, miten sitten Yle muutti juttuansa saatuaan palautetta tästä virheellistä uutisoimisesta. Eli tämmöisiä ajankohtaisia asioita. Patmos-viesti pitää sinut kiinni sanassa ja ajassa. Tämä ISRAEL NYT -katsaus tänään, sen tarjoaa jälleen sinulle Patmos-lähetyssäätiö. Minä olen Pasi Turunen, Patmos-lähetyssäätiön toiminnanjohtaja. Tosiaan joitakin aikoja sitten, en nyt osaa sanoa tarkkaan milloin, niin törmäsin internetissä sellaisen puhujan ja luennoitsijan kuin Einat Wilf. Hän on toiminut aikanaan Israelin parlamentissa Knessetissä. Hänellä on tohtori yhteiskuntatieteestä muistaakseni. Hän on opiskellut Harvardin yliopistossa. Hän on kirjoittanut kirjoja Israelin historiasta, sionismista ja niin edelleen. Ja hänen tapansa niin kuin esittää äärimmäisen selkeästi ja ymmärrettävästi monimutkaisiakin asioita teki minun syvän vaikutuksen. Ja viime lähetyksen jälkeen, eli eilettäin, törmäsin erittäin mielenkiintoiseen Einat Wilfin puheenvuoroon. Nimittäin tästä ei ole kovin kauaa, kun Einat Wilf vieraili YK:n päämajassa New Yorkissa ja piti siellä YK:n valtuuskunnille tiedotustilaisuuden, jossa hän selosti, miksi ja millä tavoin UNRWA, jonka roolista lokakuun 7. päivän hyökkäyksen jälkeen on paljon keskusteltu, on osa Gazan ja Lähi-idän ongelmaa eikä suinkaan sen ratkaisua, ja kuinka se itse asiassa muodostaa semmoisen ideologisen selkärangan sille terroristiselle toiminnalle, joka on kummunnut sitten palestiinalaisväestön keskuudessa erilaisena terroristisena järjestöinä. Ja tämä puheenvuoro ja tiedotustilaisuus oli sellainen taas niitä hetkiä omassa elämässä, kun että katsonpa tuosta vähän, että mitä tästä tulee, ja se semmoinen vähän reilu puolen tunnin tiedotustilaisuus piti minut koko aika otteessaan, koska Einat Wilfin kyky puhua asioista selkeästi ja selkokielellä on todella ihailtavaa. Ja niinpä tekstitin tämän tiedotustilaisuuden suomeksi, ja tänään tässä ISRAEL NYT -katsauksessa katsomme yhdessä Einat Wilfin tiedotustilaisuuden. Kuvauksen laatu ei siinä ole ollut mitenkään erityisen niin kuin hienoa, mutta sanoisinko näin, että nyt jälleen kerran content is king, eli sisältö rulettaa. Joten tervetuloa ISRAEL NYT -katsauksen pariin. Tästä lähdetään suoraan tähän Einat Wilfin tiedotustilaisuuteen. Tervetuloa mukaan. Mä painelen täällä nappeja ihan hulluna ja ihan vääriä nappeja. Tää johtuu tästä mun jetlagistani, että vielä 10 tunnin aikaero painaa, mutta uusi yritys, NYT, nyt.
Okay, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. My name is Einat Wilf. I was a member of parliament in Israel on behalf of the Labour Party with Ehud Barak. I worked with Yossi Beilin, the architect of the Oslo Accords, with Shimon Peres as Vice Prime Minister of Israel. I call myself today a long-term peace activist, and one of the reasons that I have spent 15 years of my life by now writing, researching, speaking, advocating on issues relating to UNRWA is because I believe that anyone who seriously wants to seek peace and not just to talk about it should look deeply into the way that UNRWA has been an obstacle to that eventuality. So I hope to make the compelling case that I have not wasted the last 15 years of my life by focusing on UNRWA, and I want to make the case that UNRWA is not some kind of fringe issue or a small aspect. If you want to understand the conflict, if you want to understand how we got here, and even more important, if you want to understand how we get out of here, how we get out of the conflict, how we move forward, UNRWA is the key. So first, a bit of history, because in the history we understand pretty much everything. After the war of 1948, there are hundreds of thousands of refugees. That is not special, as I'm sure you know, certainly being in the United Nations. The 20th century is marked by the political transition from empires to states. We begin the 20th century when much of the world is divided between empires. We end the 20th century when much of the world is divided between states. That's why we have almost 200 in the United Nations. This process has been bloody. It involved 2 world wars, numerous regional wars, and civil wars. In the process of the transition from empires to states, tens of millions of people became refugees. Hindus and Muslims, Germans, Ukrainians, Poles, Bulgarians, Turks, Greeks, Jews. And as the process took place, the message to all these tens of millions of refugees was clear. It's tough, it's tragic, and you move on. This is why there are hundreds of millions of descendants, of many of whom you are, I'm sure, do not consider themselves refugees today. Except for one group, the Palestinians. Why is it? After the War of 1948, I will add in parentheses an entirely unnecessary war, because the Arabs, as you well know from the UN partition plan, could have said yes, had an Arab state living side by side in peace to a Jewish state. But they themselves said it was more important for them that there should not be a Jewish state anywhere between the river and the sea than they should have an Arab state in part of it. So they go to a completely unnecessary war. It's a brutal 1.5-year long war. And in the course of that war, people become refugees. It's not special. The refugees are to be settled. The Jewish refugees are settled, of course, by Israel. And the Arab refugees are to be settled by a temporary mechanism. Now, it's not special at that time to have a temporary mechanism to settle refugees. Why? Because, again, it's understood that once the war is over, the refugees are settled, and settling refugees is how you end wars. So the idea is to create a temporary mechanism for 18 months, because the assumption is that 18 months should be enough time to settle several hundreds of thousands Arab refugees in the places to which they fled or were expelled: the West Bank, Gaza, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. But the Arab refugees themselves refuse to settle. They attack the installations. They attack the staff. Why? Because they understand that if they are settled, then the war is over and the Jewish state gets to live. And that is unacceptable. They just waged a brutal 1.5-year war so that there would not be a Jewish state. They waged a 30-year war before that against it, but especially 1.5 years. So they refuse to settle. So what they do is they take this temporary mechanism and they do 3 things. The first is this temporary mechanism was going to be called REWA, or UNRWA. But they want it to be called UNRWA. They want the letters UN to be in it. Why? Because from their perspective, the UN is responsible for the fact that they are refugees. The fact that they just waged a completely unnecessary war, they completely do not consider it. The fact that the refugees are the consequences of that war, none of their business. In their telling, the UN created Israel. They always refused to grant the Jews agency. So the UN created Israel. The West created Israel. The UN is responsible. So they insist that this mechanism be called UNRWA, so that it be clear from the beginning that the UN is responsible for the fact that there are Arab refugees from the war. And this is an ideology that plagues us to the present. Abu Marzouk, a senior Hamas official, said in an interview a few months ago, when he was asked, why don't you let the people of Gaza use the tunnels for their protection? And he's like, what? The tunnels are for us. The people of Gaza, they're the responsibility of the UN. So he is still telling you, this is still fundamental to the ideology, that they are not responsible. It's the responsibility of the UN. So 1, they want it to be called UNRWA. 2, they want to create a loophole. Why? Because during the 18 months when UNRWA is created as a temporary mechanism to settle the refugees, the UN creates the actual body for the refugees, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, to implement the Refugee Convention. Now, according to the Refugee Convention is indeed in the spirit of settling refugees. So according to the Refugee Convention, there are 3 ways where one can no longer be a refugee. One is return. If you can return home, great, wonderful. But if not, the Refugee Convention does not prioritize repatriation and return. You can either be settled in place or get citizenship and protection of a third country. All of these are equally valid means of ending a refugee status. Now, the Arab refugees and their supporters in the Arab world, which were the ones who were pushing it through the UN, knew that if the Arabs would be settled according to the Refugee Convention, within a few years, there would be no more Arab refugees, which means that the war is over and the Jewish state gets to live, again, unacceptable. So they want a loophole. And the way they secure the loophole is that the UNHCR says that it will deal with all refugees in the world except those who have an agency. And now step 3 is to make sure that the agency never closes. Because the loophole, the fact that the Arab refugees are not subject to the Refugee Convention and to the international standards, depends on the fact that UNRWA should never close. And just so we have a sense of what it looks like when a temporary refugee agency actually does its job. You know, we don't always have alternative history in the world, but sometimes we do. So a bit after UNRWA is established, there is another temporary agency established for the war in Korea, and it's called UNRWA. The K is for Korea. In Korea, there are 3.1 million refugees, more than 4 times the number of Arab refugees. UNRWA settles all of them in 3 years with 1/3 of UNRWA's budget. No one returns home. And look at South Korea today. It could have been the Palestinians. It could have been the Arab world. South Korea was a wasteland in the early 50s, and look what they made of it. You don't have 20 million Korean refugee descendants sitting on the 38th parallel, seething with visions of revenge. They moved on, like all tens of millions of refugees from that time, and built a different future. But the Arab refugees would not, and because this is the Cold War and there's oil, the Arab countries are able to push the West to get their way. So UNRWA is called UNRWA, it gets a loophole, and it never closes. So now we're at the end of the 50s, and we have a situation. UNRWA is clearly a failed agency. Just so there's no questions, everyone knows already in the 50s that UNRWA is a failed agency because it's not settling a single Arab refugee. But also, the West and the UN have just been blackmailed by the Arab world to not close UNRWA. So UNRWA cannot settle a single refugee. It can't close. So what is it going to do? And it begins to do busy work. Initially, vocational training. The vocational training soon becomes the vast education network of UNRWA in the West Bank, Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. Now, in that education system, essentially a Palestinian nationalism is born. In the UNRWA schools, it brings together all the Arab refugees to create a Palestinian nationalism, which in itself is not a problem. A lot of nationalisms were born after World War II. Except that the nationalism that is born in the UNRWA schools is one that is singularly focused on revenge and return. Under the letters UN and with Western funding, generation after generation is being brought up with that loophole to believe that they are still refugees. And I'll explain in a moment how ridiculous it is according to international standards. And their entire identity is based not on a positive, constructive vision of creating a Palestinian state, but on the destructive vision of destroying the Jewish state. And just in case people think that return is an innocent idea, when I called the book The War of Return, people thought it was a bit harsh. People think that return is some innocent idea, a nostalgia for a home of a great-grandmother long gone. If you read the Arab-Palestinian texts from the 50s and 60s, they're very clear about what return is. Return is October 7th. Return is described in the Palestinian texts as a brutal triumph over the Jewish state. We will tear their hearts out of their bodies, their fingernails. This is why you saw so much exhilaration and elation on October 7th. Because for 75 years, Palestinians in the UNRWA schools have been groomed for that moment of the brutal triumph over the Jewish state. That is their vision of return. That has been under the letters UN and with Western funding. And the connection between UNRWA and terrorism is an old one. When the Western countries caved to our pressure to keep UNRWA open, they thought, okay, this organization will do no good. They knew that this organization will do no good, but they thought at least it would do no harm. Thank you. But imagine that you go to school every day, and the letters UN are above your school, and you know that it's funded with Western money, so the nice kind of countries, and you hear in that school that there was once a mythical land of Palestine, and it was stolen from you, and it is occupied by evil foreigners who don't belong there. And one day, when you grow up, you have the duty, the noble duty, to liberate Palestine from the river to the sea. If you hear that every day, you will grow up, and the first person that puts a gun in your hand and tells you, we are going to the 1972 Munich Olympics, we are going to the quarters of the Israeli athletes, you are going to be elated. You are going to be thrilled. And this is why the perpetrators of the massacre of the Israeli athletes in the 1972 Munich Olympics are children of the UNRWA schools. It's graduates. This is why Hamas are the graduates of the UNRWA systems, the schools, the so-called refugee camps. It is an intimate connection. It actually doesn't matter if 5 or 10 or 15 or 0 UNRWA employees actually participated in the October 7th massacre. Because UNRWA is the ideological backbone that births, decade after decade, generation after generation, violent Palestinian organization committed to the idea of liberating Palestine. Will change nothing as long as UNRWA continues to serve as this ideological backbone that births terrorist organizations committed to the idea of return and revenge and no Jewish state. So how do we get out of it? First of all, we need to understand the absurdity of the situation. Because UNRWA has this loophole, UNRWA doesn't operate by any international standards. It counts today 5.9 million refugees. Almost none of them, by any international standard, are refugees. 40% of them are citizens of Jordan. Tomorrow, Jordan will try to present to you as if UNRWA is necessary. I'll tell you why. Because Jordan was actually the one country that was willing to make peace with Israel after 1949. And precisely because Jordan was willing to make peace and it annexed the West Bank and naturalized the Arab refugees, gave them citizenship, and declared that Jordan is Palestine, Palestine is Jordan, King Abdullah was assassinated by a Palestinian extremist precisely for that. So ever since, the Jordanians are kind of very, very edgy on this issue of Palestinian refugees, because I understand the stability of their kingdom. But it's not for any real reason that has to do with the refugees themselves. So 40% of those registered by UNRWA as refugees are Jordanian citizens. They have been born in Jordan, they have lived in Jordan, they have never been displaced by war, they are wealthy business people. 82% of those who are registered by UNRWA in Jordan as refugees, they don't live in the camps. They are wealthy business people. They travel. They're middle class, not what you think of as refugees. They're citizens with passports. Nowhere in the world are citizens of a country, born in that country, never displaced by war, refugees from another country in which they've never lived. It doesn't exist. Only the UNRWA loophole allows UNRWA to register more than 2 million Jordanian citizens as refugees from Palestine. This is how absurd it is. Another 40% live in the West Bank and Gaza. Whatever your political views, let's agree that the West Bank and Gaza are Palestine. Many of your countries recognize Palestine as a state. So let's agree that they live in Palestine. It means that by now we're into the 5th generation of people having been born in Palestine, living in Palestine, never displaced from Palestine, yet being registered by an agency that has the letters UN in it as refugees from Palestine. This is absurd unless you believe in Palestine from the river to the sea, which is exactly what the Palestinians and the refugees believe in. That's why they can be a 30-year-old middle-class lawyer living in Ramallah. And again, 75% of those registered as refugees living in the West Bank don't live in the camps. The camps, of course, are not camps. They're by now stable neighborhoods. But again, a 30-year-old lawyer living in Ramallah, born in Ramallah, never having left Ramallah, is registered by UNRWA as a refugee from Palestine. It makes no sense if you think Palestine should be part of a two-state solution, West Bank and Gaza, as I believe. It makes perfect sense if you want Palestine to be from the river to the sea. Another 20% are still registered in Syria and Lebanon. We know from recent data that at least 2/3 of them have left. Many of them have gotten citizenship of other countries. So much so that my favorite refugee is the American citizen, multimillionaire, father of supermodels Gigi and Bella Hadid. This is not exactly what you think of as a refugee. And yet UNRWA's loopholes is so absurd that it doesn't take anyone off their lists, even if they got citizenship of Canada, America, or Germany, as many of those who left Syria and Lebanon have achieved. So we are now down to about 200,000, 300,000 people living in Lebanon and Syria. 20,000, 30,000 of them are truly refugees in the sense that they crossed a border, left mandatory Palestine, displaced by war. Another 200,000, 300,000 of their descendants are properly known as stateless because, as the ambassador said, Syria and Lebanon discriminate against them by law and refuse to give them citizenship. That's it. That's 5% of the total inflated number that UNRWA claims. So the refugee issue is actually, in practice, a very small issue. 200,000, 300,000 stateless peoples is something that the UN High Commissioner for Refugees deals with all the time. Within a few years, it settles it. So the actual problem is minute, but the symbolic issue is huge. Because to the Palestinians, the idea of perpetual refugeehood as the code word for no Jewish state is the essence of who they are. So the only way we will ever get to peace is by removing this obstacle. Is if the Palestinians, 75 years too late, will finally get the memo that everybody else in the world got, and they were exempted from, of tough, tragic, and move on. The message that they need to get after 75 years is that you can live next to the Jewish state of Israel, but not instead of it. When you are a Jordanian citizen, when you live in the West Bank and Gaza, you are not a refugee from Palestine. You are already where you should be and where your future is. You can build your future in the West Bank and Gaza next to the Jewish state, but not in an eternal limbo waiting for this idea of violent, triumphant return when there is no Jewish state. And certainly the UN, and certainly not the West, will not continue to fund it. So then people ask me over the years, what will replace UNRWA? So first, when you begin to understand that UNRWA is the arsonist rather than the firefighter, you begin to understand how ridiculous this question is. Why would you want to replace the arsonist? Why? Why would you want to replace the body that creates the ideological infrastructure that ensures that peace is never possible, that two states is never possible, that Palestinians will never move forward to build their state because they continue to believe that they can achieve the destruction of the Jewish state? Why would you ever want to replace an arsonist? But if you want to talk about the practice, the answers are really simple. UNRWA, again, most of the services are not given anymore, but in Jordan, there is a country. People, the education system, the healthcare system, to be supplied by the government of Jordan. You want to give more money to Jordan? By all means, I support that. But no one in Jordan is a refugee from Palestine. Enough. I understand their desire to keep the lie because they think it's necessary to keep the Hashemite kingdom, but it's a lie. No one who's a citizen of Jordan is a refugee from Palestine. Enough. There's no reason for UNRWA to be there. In the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority, it's supposed to be the state in the making. Under what conditions does it make sense that in Ramallah you have a school of the Palestinian Authority and a school of UNRWA? What I call a school of Little Palestine and a school of from the river to the sea Palestine. What exactly is the message here? When officials of the PA, when the Pope comes to visit, when Prince William comes to visit, their itinerary says they're visiting Palestine, so properly a state. The first place they go to visit, they're taken by their hosts, is a refugee camp. Why is there a refugee camp? Many of them, again, they're not refugees, they're not camps, they're neighborhoods in Palestine. What's the message? Again, they know the message. The message is from the river to the sea. But to the extent that you don't want to fund this message anymore, then in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority is responsible for schools and healthcare. In Syria and Lebanon, as I said, most people don't live there anymore. The few that remain should be under the responsibility of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees with a clear 5-year plan to settle all of them, the way you did in other places, and now Gaza. For many years, when I would go through all these places, I said the answers are simple, and they say, well, what about Gaza? What? You want Hamas to manage the schools? And I said, it would be better. And that made me sound like a crazy person. So now I'll tell you why we now, after October 7th, we really know it would have been better. So let's discuss a bit, what does it mean for UNRWA to be in Gaza? UNRWA, unlike what it's pretending right now, is not an aid organization. Again, UNRWA is the ideological backbone of the idea of the perpetual Palestinian refugeehood. All the services, the education, healthcare is what it does as it keeps the idea of perpetual refugeehood and no Jewish state alive. All the people in UNRWA are Palestinian. Remember that the Arabs wanted UNRWA to have the letters UN. The letters UN are so powerful that when people hear UNRWA in Gaza, they actually think it's a foreign aid organization. But all the people who are there are Gazans, born in Gaza. They are the teachers, they are the administrators. There is only to UNRWA, not even in Gaza, a thin layer of Italians and Swiss who are the people who ask you for money. But other than that, it's a purely Palestinian organization. So let's imagine what it means if there's no longer UNRWA, if you defund UNRWA. What does it mean in practice in Gaza? Nobody leaves, right? Those are Gazans. The teachers are Gazans. It's not like Swedes and Norwegians who go home. Nobody leaves. These are Gazan teachers. These are Gazan administrators. Everyone stays. The school stays. Everything stays. So now the only question is who pays their salaries? Because that's the only thing that remains. They are given the message finally that in living in Gaza, they are now refugees in Palestine, so they need to begin to build their future in Gaza. They are given the message that there is no return into the sovereign territory of Israel within its pre-67 lines. And someone needs to pay teachers' salaries now. Now imagine for a moment, I know this is going to sound like a radical idea. Imagine that Hamas had to pay teachers' salaries. Imagine that they actually had to use all the taxes that they collected from the tunnels with Egypt to pay teachers' salaries. Imagine that they had to fight with teacher unions. Maybe they would have had less time to build 700 kilometers of tunnels. Maybe they would have had less time, as Abu Marzouk said, we're focusing on butchering Jews. You, the world, take care of Palestinians. Maybe they would have actually had to focus on their people. You know, Hamas now has massive financial and economic assets that they have shielded from sanctions. Maybe they would have had to use some of that money to pay teacher salaries, to take care and to manage, because they're the governing authority in Gaza. What UNRWA has allowed Hamas to do is to release them from any responsibility for their people. And essentially send the message, you Hamas, you focus on butchering Jews, we'll pay teacher salaries. So I want to introduce the absolutely radical idea that Palestinians are perfectly capable people. They're not some incapable charity basket case. If October 7th proved anything, is that Palestinians are a highly capable people. October 7th required massive investment in infrastructure, planning, financial and economic planning. It required vision, a perverse kind of vision, but vision. These are not an incapable people. They are just a people who for 75 years have been allowed to focus singularly on one priority of no Jewish state. It's a terrible fate for a people. And I'll end by saying, for the 15 years that I've been spoken about it, you can hear me, what I say sounds tough and harsh. But what I've come to tell many foreign policy people is that in this world, whether it's in foreign policy or governance or parenting for that matter, there is a difference between doing good and feeling good. A lot of people just want to feel good. A lot of people in foreign policy just want to feel good. They give money to UNRWA, they think it makes them feel good. But doing good requires doing things that often don't feel good. But they will actually do good. Supporting UNRWA, I can tell you that for years, I would go to European capitals, funders of UNRWA, and I would tell them, look, you're feeling very good about yourselves, you're funding UNRWA, but my people will pay for it in blood. And I told them that for years, because you keep funding the Palestinian vision of no Jewish state of return. And you feel good about funding UNRWA. But if you want to do good, doing good requires doing the things that don't feel good. Defund UNRWA and send the Palestinians the memo that the Germans got, and the Hindus and the Muslims and the Ukrainians and the Poles and the Turks and the Greeks, the memo they all got which allowed them to actually build their countries. It's tough, it's tragic, but you move on. That's how you create a better future. Thank you.
Näin siinä tohtori Einat Wilf New Yorkissa YK-valtuustolle pitämässä tiedotustilaisuudessa, ja oi pojat, olipahan melkoinen tietoisku ja erinomainen tuommoinen niin kuin analyysi UNRWAn roolista, ja tämähän liittyy tähän laajempaan keskusteluun siitä, että Israel veti esiin todisteet siitä, että sadat Gazassa UNRWAlle työskentelevät henkilöt ovat siis terroristijärjestö Hamasin jäseniä, ja useat toistakymmentä heistä osallistui lokakuun 7. päivän iskuun, ja tuhansilla UNRWAn työntekijöillä on yhteyksiä Hamas-terroristijärjestöön islamilaiseen jihadiin, ja sen takia UNRWA ei ole osa ratkaisua, vaan se on osa ongelmaa. Siitä on tullut gazalaisten terroristijärjestöjen, erityisesti Hamasin tuommoinen fronttiorganisaatio, ja se pitää lakkauttaa ja lopettaa. Tämä oli hyvä esitys siihen, ja valitettavasti Suomikin on jatkanut tuota rahoitusta. Yhdysvallat ei ole toistaiseksi sitä jatkanut, vaan jäädyttänyt UNRWAn rahoituksen vuoteen 2025 saakka, muistaakseni. Tämä keskustelu tulee jatkumaan, ja toivottavasti tästäkin videopätkästä oli sinulle iloa ja hyötyä. Löydät sen linkkinä myöskin Facebook-seinältäni suoraan, ja kannattaa sitä jakaa ystävillesi ja omilla seinälläsi ihan ahkerasti. Tässä oli ISRAEL nyt tällä kertaa. Kiitos seurasta, ja ensi kerralla, milloin tahansa se sitten koittaa, taas tavataan. Moi moi!